The day my son told a room full of people that I had lost my mind, I was wearing my best Audai, the pale blue one I saved for important occasions, and I was sitting straight-backed in a chair that smelled faintly of someone else's furniture polish. "She's not competent enough to know what she wants anymore," Vincent said. "And we have a doctor who'll confirm it in writing." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the lawyer sitting across the table, a thin man with clean fingernails who was writing something on a yellow notepad. Celeste sat beside Vincent, one hand resting on the table, her nails the color of dried blood. She nodded slowly, as if Vincent had said something reasonable. Something kind, even. I smiled. Not a wide smile. Just the small, private kind, the one that lives at the corner of the mouth and doesn't quite reach the eyes. The kind that takes decades to learn. No one in that room understood it. I could see that clearly. The lawyer glanced at me once and looked away. Celeste's eyes narrowed for just a moment before she composed herself. Vincent finally turned to look at me, and what he saw his 68-year-old mother sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap, and that half smile on her face seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have. "Good, it should." I said nothing. I let the silence sit in the room like a third presence, filling the corners, pressing against the window glass. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold, and the neighbor's jasmine was sending its smell through the gap in the door. Sweet and too much, the way jasmine always is in late afternoon. I breathed it in. Vincent cleared his throat. The lawyer asked a question I didn't answer. Celeste reached for her water glass and set it down without drinking. The yellow notepad filled with more words I couldn't read from where I sat. All of this, I watched. All of this, I recorded. I should tell you how I came to be sitting in that chair. But first, you need to understand the house. I have lived in the same house for 41 years. My husband Fook built the front gate himself, post by post, in the summer of 1983. He was not a man who talked about love with words. He was a man who mixed concrete on a Saturday morning and called that love instead. When he died, 11 years ago now, I kept the gate exactly as he left it, down to the small lean it developed on the left side from the roots of the old frangipani pushing up underneath. The house sits behind that gate, like something that has decided to stay. The walls have darkened with time. The altar in the main room holds Fook's photograph, his favorite teacup, a brass incense burner that his mother gave us the year we married. Every morning, I light 2 sticks of incense. Every morning the smoke rises in a thin line and then bends, the way smoke always does, toward whatever the air wants it to reach. This house has a land certificate. It has a deed. It has 41 years of property tax receipts. In a green folder in the second drawer of my desk, rubber-banded in groups of 5. I know this because I put them there. Because I have always been the kind of woman who puts things where they belong and keeps track of where that is. For 35 years, I was a psychiatric nurse. Not the kind who wheels patients to appointments and smiles at doctors in hallways. The kind who sits in a room with someone who cannot separate what is real from what is not, and speaks to them slowly, clearly, asking questions that have specific purposes. I assessed cognitive function. I documented behavioral patterns. I recognized with a single conversation what a person's mind was and was not capable of. I know what a proper psychiatric evaluation looks like. I know every question on every standardized scale. I know when the questions are designed to help a patient, and I know with absolute certainty when the questions are designed to produce a particular answer. The morning the man came to my house with his clipboard and his careful smile, I knew within 4 minutes. He was not there to help me. It had started 6 weeks before that morning. Or perhaps it had started years before that. I am still not certain exactly when Vincent looked at this house and stopped seeing his father's gate and his mother's altar and started seeing something he could sell. These things do not announce themselves. They move like water under floorboards, quietly, until one day the wood begins to give. What I can tell you is that in March, Vincent began calling more frequently. This was unusual. My son is not an unkind man. He is worse than unkind, in certain ways, because he is the kind of man who believes that what he wants is also what is right. He called and asked about my health. He asked whether I had been driving. He asked, with that careful gentleness he uses when he has already made a decision, whether I had been remembering to pay my bills. I had been paying my bills since before he was born. Celeste began visiting on Sundays. She brought fruit, the expensive kind, arranged in a basket with cellophane and ribbon, and sat in the good chair, and asked me questions about my neighbors, my routines, my sleep. She asked if I sometimes forgot where I had put things. She asked if I ever felt confused in the mornings. I answered what I chose to answer. I watched what she was building and said nothing that would show her I could see it. My youngest daughter Lily noticed something was wrong before I told her. She has always been like that. She called me on a Wednesday night and said, quietly, "Mom, what is Vincent doing?" I told her I was still gathering information. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, but be careful." I told her I had been careful my entire life. That was not quite true, but it was true enough. That evening, after Fook's anniversary dinner, the one I prepare alone every year, the caramelized pork and the jasmine rice, and the single cup of tea I set out for him, I sat in front of the altar and looked at his photograph for a long time. The incense had burned down to nothing. The smoke was gone. The room smelled of sandalwood and old wood and the frangipani coming in from the garden. I thought of something my grandmother used to say when I was a child. Watching her work in the kitchen without hurry, without waste, without a single unnecessary movement. Still, water runs deepest. I straightened my back. I went to the second drawer and took out the green folder. Then I opened my notebook, the one I have kept every day since retirement, in the habit of a woman who spent 3 decades writing clinical observations, and I began, in my careful handwriting, to document everything I had seen. Fook used to say that a house is not built from the outside in. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without looking up from whatever his hands were doing, as if the words were just another task to complete before sundown. I was 26 years old the first time I heard him say it. We were standing in the empty lot on Tran Hung Dao Street, the one his uncle had left him, and the ground was nothing but red clay and old grass and a single mango tree that leaned so far to the left it looked like it was listening for something underground. "From the outside in," I repeated. "You start with what you want to protect," he said. "Then you build around it." I did not fully understand what he meant until we had lived in that house for 15 years, and I looked around one evening at everything inside it, the altar, the children's drawings still tacked to the kitchen wall, the particular smell of the place that was ours and no one else's, and understood that this was what he had been protecting all along. We moved in during the rainy season of 1983. Lily was not yet born. Vincent was 8 years old and immediately claimed the back room as his territory, dragging his school bag and his comic books inside, and closing the door with the authority of a child who believes possession is final. My second son, Martin, was 6 and followed his brother everywhere in those years like a small, earnest shadow. The altar went up first. Fook carried the old altar table from his mother's house in 2 pieces, wrapped in cloth, across the city in the back of a borrowed truck. He assembled it himself in the main room, against the east wall where the morning light came through strongest. He set out the incense burner his mother had used, the small brass one with the dragon handles worn smooth from decades of hands. He placed his father's photograph, his grandmother's photograph, a coupe forte. Then he stood back and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Now the house knows who we are," he said. I have thought about that sentence many times since he died. In the years after, when I was learning to live alone in rooms that had once been full of his particular silences, I understood that what he meant was not superstition. He meant that a house needs to be told its own history, needs to hold it somewhere visible, so that everyone who walks through the door understands what kind of place they have entered. His photograph is still there, the teacup, the brass burner with the dragon handles. Every morning I light 2 sticks of incense, and I tell the house what day it is. Those early years were not easy in the way that people sometimes romanticize hardship. They were simply busy. Fook worked construction. I worked the psychiatric ward at the district hospital, 6 days out of 7, taking the early shift because the bus came at 5:40 and the hospital was 40 minutes away, and the ward did not wait for anyone to be ready. The work was hard in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not done it. You sat with people whose minds had turned against them. You spoke slowly, and without alarm. You asked the same questions in different ways, until you found the way that reached them. You watched for the small signs, a shift in the eyes, a change in how a person held their hands, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was about to say something true. You wrote everything down, not because you distrusted your own memory, but because documentation was the only thing that stood between a patient and whatever someone else might decide about them later. I learned, in 35 years of that work, that the most dangerous moment in a person's life is not when they are suffering. It is when someone with authority decides they know better than the suffering person what that person needs. I learned to keep records. I brought that habit home with me every evening. While Fook sat with the boys doing their homework, while the rice cooker made its particular clicking sound on the counter, I sat at my desk in the corner of the bedroom and wrote in my notebook, not always about work, sometimes about the children. The things they had said that day, the way Martin had asked, at age 7, why some people's minds got sick the same way bodies did, and whether the mind could scar the way skin did. I wrote down his question. I wrote down my answer. I have notebooks going back to 1981. Fook died in the spring, 11 years ago. His heart, the doctor said, as if that explained something. As if a heart simply decided one morning that it had worked long enough. He had not been sick in any visible way. He had been slower, yes. He had stopped taking the stairs 2 at a time. He sat longer over his morning coffee, and sometimes I would come into the kitchen and find him looking out the window at the frangipani tree, the one we had planted together the year Lily was born, with an expression I could not quite name. I did not write down that expression. I wish I had. The altar expanded after he died. I added his photograph in the center, between his parents. I bought a new teacup, the blue one with the white rim, the kind he always chose when we went to the market together, because he said plain things lasted longer than decorated ones. I set it out every morning with fresh tea, and every evening I poured the tea away and washed the cup and put it back. The children came for the first year, all 3 of them. Vincent and his wife Celeste, Martin and his family from Denning, Lily who was not yet married and lived nearby, and came every Sunday without being asked. We sat together, and ate, and talked about their father, and the house felt, in those evenings, the way it was meant to feel. Then Martin's work moved him further south. Then Lily became busy with her own life. Then Vincent's visits grew shorter, more purposeful, and I began to notice that when he walked through the house, his eyes moved differently than they used to. Not looking at the altar or the photographs or the old marks on the kitchen doorframe where Fook had measured the boys' heights every year until they refused to let him anymore. Looking at the walls, the floor, the windows, the roof. I noticed. I said nothing. I poured Fook's tea each morning and watched the smoke from the incense rise and bend, and thought about the things that change so slowly that by the time you see them clearly, they have already finished changing. The summer Vincent began calling more frequently. Lily came to visit on a Sunday and sat across from me at the kitchen table, and looked at me the way she had as a child when she knew something was wrong but did not yet have the words. "Mom," she said, "are you all right?" I told her I was fine. I poured her tea. I asked about her work. But that night, lying in the room I had shared with Fook for 30 years, listening to the frangipani move in the dark outside the window, I found myself thinking about the green folder in the second drawer and wondering, for the first time, whether I had kept enough. The doctor arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday is the day I changed the water in the vase on the altar, the white chrysanthemums. Fook always preferred, and I had just finished when I heard the gate. I set down the old flowers and dried my hands on my housecloth and went to see who had come without calling first. Vincent was at the gate. He was wearing his work clothes, the pressed gray shirt he favored for client meetings, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning. Behind him stood a man I did not recognize. Slight build, mid-40s perhaps. He carried a clipboard against his chest the way some people carry shields, and he had the particular smile of someone who has been told to appear friendly and is concentrating on it. "Mother." Vincent opened the gate without asking. "I hope we're not interrupting." "You should have called," I said. "I tried this morning. You didn't answer." I had answered. I had seen his number and set the phone down and gone back to my chrysanthemums. But I did not say this. "This is Dr. Nguyen," Vincent said. "He's a colleague of a colleague. He does wellness assessments for older adults." I thought it might be good, since you've been living alone. I looked at the man with the clipboard. He smiled with his mouth. "Just a conversation," he said. "Very informal. Nothing to worry about. I have spent 35 years listening to people tell patients that things are nothing to worry about. I know precisely what that phrase is used to cover. I stepped back from the door and let them in. We sat in the main room. The incense from the morning had burned down, but the smell of it still lived in the curtains, in the wood of the altar table, in the particular warmth that old rooms hold. Dr. Hien set his clipboard on his knee and uncapped a pen and looked around the room with the careful neutrality of someone performing casualness. "You have a lovely home," he said. "Thank you. How long have you lived here?" 41 years. He wrote something. I watched his pen move without appearing to watch. Short note. 3 or 4 words. "And you live alone now?" "Since my husband passed. 11 years. That's a long time. Do you find it difficult? Managing everything by yourself?" "No." Another note. Longer this time. Vincent sat in the chair by the window, Fuchs' chair, the one with the flattened armrests, and said nothing. He was watching me the way I had watched patients in my early years of nursing, before I learned that the watching itself changes what you see. His hands were very still in his lap. Dr. Hien moved through his questions in a rhythm I recognized within the first 4 minutes. He asked me what day it was. What month? What year? He asked me to name the current prime minister. He asked whether I ever felt confused in the morning or had trouble remembering recent events. He asked if I sometimes misplaced things and couldn't recall where I had put them. These are real questions. They appear on real cognitive assessments. But the order was wrong, and the framing was wrong, and twice he interrupted my answers before I had finished giving them, which is not how any properly administered evaluation proceeds. You do not interrupt. You wait. You record the full response, including how long it takes, including the self-corrections, including what the person does when they are uncertain. He was not recording a real assessment. He was building something. I answered each question clearly, completely, without hesitation. When he asked whether I sometimes forgot words mid-sentence, I said no, and asked him which specific screening tool he was using. The question caught him sideways. He looked down at his clipboard. "This is just a general wellness conversation," he said. "I understand. But you're asking items from a cognitive screen." I worked psychiatric nursing for 35 years. "I'm curious which instrument you're working from." He smiled again. This time the smile was thinner. "Just standard questions," he said. "Nothing formal." Vincent shifted in Fuchs' chair. Dr. Hien continued. He asked about my sleep, my appetite, whether I had any difficulty with the stairs, whether I sometimes felt overwhelmed by daily tasks. Each question delivered with that same careful gentleness, the kind that is designed to feel like concern and function like a net. I answered. I watched. I said nothing about what I was watching. They stayed for 40 minutes. When they left, Vincent paused at the gate and put his hand on my shoulder and said he just wanted to make sure I was being taken care of. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed. The words were the right words. The feeling behind them was somewhere else entirely. I closed the gate and went back inside. I stood at the altar for a moment. Fuchs' photograph, the teacup, the brass burner with the dragon handles, the new chrysanthemums, white and clean in the vase, not yet knowing they had a week before I would replace them. Then I went to my desk and opened my notebook. I wrote the date, the time of arrival, the time of departure, Vincent's clothing, the name the doctor had given, and the institution he had mentioned in passing, a private clinic on the edge of the district, not affiliated with any hospital I recognized. I wrote every question Dr. Hien had asked, in the order he had asked them. I wrote my responses. I wrote his interruptions and the precise moments they occurred. I wrote, questions not consistent with any standardized protocol, order irregular, responses partially recorded. Assessment appears designed to reach predetermined conclusion. I underlined the last sentence. Then I sat back and looked at the wall above my desk, where I had hung, years ago, the small framed certificate from my final year of practice. The one that said I was competent in the administration and interpretation of psychiatric assessments. I took it down. I set it on the desk beside my notebook. Then I opened the second drawer and took out the green folder and laid it on the desk as well. The folder, the notebook, the certificate, 3 things that said, in different languages, the same thing about who I was and what I knew. I had let them into my house today. I had let them run their careful little performance in my main room, under Fuchs' photograph, in the smell of old incense. I had sat quietly and answered their questions and given them nothing they could use. But I understood now what was being built. And I understood that the building had been going on for longer than one Tuesday morning. The question was not whether Vincent intended to go through with it. That answer was already clear. The question was how far along the structure already was, and how many people had already been told the version of me that he needed them to believe. That night I wrote for 2 hours without stopping. Then I sealed the notebook in an envelope and wrote the date on the outside and put it behind the altar, in the space between the table and the wall where I keep the things that matter most. The frangipani moved against the window. The house was very quiet. I thought, they have made their first move. They have shown me the shape of it. Now I know what I am dealing with. 3 days after the doctor's visit, Celeste came alone. She called ahead this time, which should have reassured me. It did not. In my experience, people who have been doing something quietly in the dark begin to call ahead precisely when they want you to believe there is nothing to see. She arrived at 10 in the morning with a paper bag of dragon fruit and a box of the longan tea I had mentioned, once, 2 years ago, that I occasionally enjoyed. The fact that she remembered a detail that small told me she had been paying closer attention than her visits suggested. I filed this away and poured hot water and set out 2 cups. We sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen faces the garden, and the frangipani was in partial bloom that week, white flowers appearing between the older leaves like small announcements. Fuchs had planted it 30 years ago. He said a tree that bloomed in its own time was worth more than one you had to coax. I had always thought he was talking about more than trees. Celeste arranged the dragon fruit on the table between us as if it were a centerpiece. She had done her hair carefully. She was wearing the kind of clothes that are chosen to look relaxed but are not. "You look well, Mother," she said. "Thank you. Are you sleeping all right?" "Yes. Because Vincent mentioned you sounded tired on the phone last week." I did not sound tired on the phone last week. I had been, in fact, quite alert. I had been organizing my filing cabinet and was irritated at being interrupted, which may have made me shorter than usual. But that is not tiredness. I know the difference. "I sleep well," I said. "I always have." She nodded and wrapped both hands around her teacup and looked at me with an expression I recognized. I had seen it on the faces of adult children who brought their parents to my ward for the first time. That mixture of performance and guilt that looks like concern from a certain angle and like something else entirely from another. "We just want to make sure you have everything you need," she said. "A woman your age, living alone in a house this size. A woman your age." The phrase did its work quietly, like all the best-placed words do. "I have what I need," I said. She stayed for an hour and 20 minutes. We talked about her work, about Vincent's new project, about the rains that were coming early this year. She helped me carry the dragon fruit to the refrigerator, and while she stood at the open refrigerator door, she said, very casually, that she had a friend in real estate who had mentioned that the property values in this district had risen significantly in the past 3 years. "This house must be worth quite a lot now," she said, with her back to me. "I wouldn't know," I said. "I'm not planning to sell it." She closed the refrigerator and turned around and smiled. "Of course not. I just meant it's good to know the value of what you have." I smiled back. I agreed that it was. After she left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car pull away from the curb. Then I went to the main room and stood at the altar for a moment, not praying exactly, but settling myself. The incense from the morning, Fuchs' photograph, the ordinary stillness of the house doing what it always did, holding its history without comment. Then I went to my desk. I had not been through the second drawer completely in several weeks. I knew what was in it. I always know what is in it, but that afternoon I took everything out and laid it on the desk in order. The green folder, the rubber-banded tax receipts, the land certificate in its clear plastic sleeve, the envelope containing the property deed, which I had not opened in perhaps 2 years because I had no reason to open it, and a document you are not opening should stay sealed. I opened it. The deed was there. The land certificate matched the deed. The registered address, the lot measurements, the ownership record, all of it consistent with what I remembered, with what I had filed, with the records I had been keeping since Fuchs and I first registered this house in our names in 1983. But there was a second sheet behind the deed that I did not put there. I sat very still for a moment. It was a single page. Plain paper, no official letterhead. A list of numbers figures that appeared to be property valuations, 3 of them, dated over the past 14 months, each one higher than the last. At the bottom of the page, 2 names I did not recognize, followed by what appeared to be a phone number with a district code I associated with the commercial real estate offices near the Central Market. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the desk beside the deed and looked at the wall. Someone had been inside this drawer. Not recently, the paper was not fresh. The fold marks had softened the way paper does when it has been handled and then left to sit. Months ago, perhaps. The last time Vincent had visited for a longer stay, helping me, he said, to sort through some of Fuchs' old documents that I had asked him to look through. I had asked him to look through a specific box on the top shelf of the storage room. I had not asked him to open the second drawer of my desk. I had not asked him to leave anything inside it. I thought about the timing. 14 months of valuations. Dr. Nguyen and his clipboard arriving 6 weeks ago. Celeste standing at my open refrigerator talking about property values with her back turned so I could not see her face. I thought about what it meant that someone had been mapping the value of this house for over a year while speaking to me about groceries and sleep and whether I was getting enough rest. I took out my notebook. I wrote the date. I described the paper in precise clinical language dimensions, condition, content, placement within the drawer. I wrote the 3 valuation figures and the 2 names and the phone number. I photographed the page with my phone before placing it back exactly where I had found it. Behind the deed, folded the same way, in the same position. Let them think I hadn't looked. I sealed the notebook in a new envelope, dated it, and placed it with the others behind the altar. Then I sat at my desk in the afternoon light coming through the garden window and thought about what I now knew and what I still did not know and what the distance between those 2 things was going to cost me. The frangipani moved in the garden. A motorbike passed on the street outside. The house settled around me the way old houses do, small sounds, small shifts, the wood and plaster doing their quiet work. My phone was on the desk beside the notebook. I picked it up and scrolled to Lily's number. I did not call her yet, because before I called my daughter, I needed to know the answer to one question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I found that page, a question so simple it should have had a simple answer, but didn't. Who else had a key to this house? There were 3 keys to this house. Mine, which I have carried on the same ring since 1983, the ring with the small brass fish that Fuchs bought from a vendor outside the hospital the day Lily was born, because he said we needed something to mark the occasion, and flowers seemed insufficient for a man who had just watched his wife work that hard. The second key had belonged to Fuchs. After he died, I put it in the tea tin on the kitchen shelf, the one that holds things I cannot bring myself to organize, a button from his good jacket, a receipt from the last meal we ate together at the noodle shop on the corner, and the key, wrapped in a square of the cloth I used to cover his face on the morning he did not wake up. The third key I had given to Vincent, not recently. Years ago, when the boys were still young and I worked early shifts, and there were mornings when the school bus came before I returned home, I had forgotten, in the decades since, that he still had it. Parents forget these things. We give our children access to our lives, and then we forget that the access remains long after the reason for it has gone. I sat at my desk for a long time thinking about this. Then I called Mrs. Hoa. Mrs. Hoa Nguyen has lived next door for 22 years. She is a retired schoolteacher who keeps a meticulous garden and an equally meticulous memory for everything that happens on our street. She notices what time people leave in the morning. She notices unfamiliar cars. She notices when a neighbor's light is on past midnight and files it away without comment, the way good teachers file away information about students not to use, but to understand. I invited her for tea that afternoon. We sat in the kitchen, and I did not immediately ask what I needed to ask. We talked about her tomatoes, which were struggling in the heat, and about the new family that had moved into the house at the end of the lane. I poured the longan tea that Celeste had brought, and did not mention where it came from. Then I said, carefully, Hoa, has Vincent been here while I was away? In the past year or so? She set down her cup. The small pause before she answered told me the answer before she spoke. Twice, she said. That I saw. Once in February you were at your medical appointment, the one you mentioned the week before. He came with Celeste. They were inside for perhaps an hour. I assumed you knew. And the second time? October, last year. He came alone. In the afternoon. He had a key. He let himself in. She looked at me steadily. You didn't know. No. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I should have told you. I'm sorry, Miriam. You had no reason to think it was anything other than what it appeared. What did it appear to be? I looked at the frangipani through the window. I'm still working that out, I said. That evening, I called Thomas Park. Thomas had been recommended to me by a colleague from the hospital, years ago, when I needed help updating Fuchs' estate documentation after he died. He was an elder law attorney, precise and unhurried, the kind of man who reads every line of a document before turning the page and does not apologize for how long that takes. I trusted him the way I trusted few people, not because he was warm, but because he was thorough. I told him I needed to meet. I told him it was not urgent but that it was serious. He gave me an appointment for Thursday morning. Then I went back to my desk and opened my laptop and spent 2 hours doing something I should have done 6 weeks ago, after Dr. Nguyen and his clipboard and his irregular questions. I searched the name of the clinic he had mentioned, the private clinic on the edge of the district. It existed. It had a website, modest and professional, listing services for geriatric wellness assessments and cognitive screening. There was a staff page. Dr. Nguyen's photograph was their different name in the listing, I noticed. Not Nguyen. The first name was the same, but the family name was different. And when I searched that name against the medical registry that I knew how to navigate from decades of professional practice, the registration was recent. Very recent. 18 months old. This was not a clinic with a long history of geriatric care. I wrote this in my notebook. I searched further. The clinic's business registration was publicly accessible. I found it after 20 minutes of patient navigation through the relevant database, the kind of navigation that feels slow unless you have spent years documenting patient records and understand that these systems reward patience over speed. The clinic had been registered 18 months ago. The listed co-owner, alongside the primary medical director, was a holding company with a name that meant nothing to me. But the registered business address of that holding company was an office in the commercial district, and when I searched that address, it appeared in connection with 3 other registered businesses. One of those businesses was a real estate consultancy. The name director of that consultancy was Celeste Tran. I sat back from the laptop. The room was very quiet. The altar candle had burned low. Outside, the street had gone to its nighttime sounds: a dog somewhere, the distant horn of a late bus, the frangipani doing its slow work in the dark. I thought about the paper I had found behind the deed. The property valuations over 14 months. The 2 names and the phone number with the commercial district code. I thought about Dr. Nguyen arriving with his clipboard and his irregular questions and his connection to a clinic that Celeste had a financial interest in through a holding company registered under a name that was not her own. I thought about what that meant. It meant the assessment was not a son's worried response to a mother living alone. It was not a family reaching out to ensure my well-being. It was a mechanism, a piece of a larger structure being assembled around me while I changed the altar flowers and kept my notebooks and assumed that blood meant the same thing to my son that it meant to me. They had not simply hired a doctor to evaluate me. They had hired a doctor connected to Celeste's own financial network to produce a document that would say whatever the document needed to say. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a moment. Then I opened it again, because there was one more thing I needed to check, one thread I had not yet pulled, though I could feel it there, underneath everything else, the way you can feel a splinter under skin before you find the precise spot to press. I searched for the legal procedure in our province for petitioning the court to declare an adult incompetent. I found the form within 4 minutes. I read through it carefully, the way I had read 1,000 clinical documents over 35 years. At the bottom of the required attachments list, the 3rd item read, psychiatric assessment conducted by a licensed practitioner, dated within the previous 6 months. The assessment Dr. Nguyen had conducted in my main room, under Fuchs' photograph, 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. I checked the date I had written in my notebook the morning of his visit. Then I counted forward 6 months. And I understood, with the cold clarity that had always been my best professional tool, that I did not have as much time as I had thought. But that was not the worst of what I found when I kept reading. The form had a field I had not initially noticed, tucked at the bottom of the second page under a section labeled Time Supporting Documentation. It asked for the signature of a second party initiating the petition. The field was not blank. Someone had already filed the form, and the signature on it was not Vincent's. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because there was too much to organize. Fear is loud. It fills the chest and crowds out thinking. What I felt that night was not fear, it was the particular cold alertness I had known in my working years when a case turned suddenly serious and the margin for error collapsed to nothing. The feeling of a mind shifting into its most careful gear. I made tea at 2 a.m. and sat at my desk and worked. By the time the first light came through the garden window and the frangipani began to show itself against the pale sky, I had filled 11 pages in my notebook. A timeline. A network of connections. A list of what I knew, what I could prove, and what I still needed to find. 3 columns, written in the small, precise hand I had used for clinical documentation for 35 years, because a habit that long does not leave you simply because you have retired. I looked at the 3 columns for a long time. The first was the longest. The second was shorter but solid. The third, what I still needed, was where the work was. I made a fresh cup of tea, changed the altar flowers though it was not yet Tuesday, and began. Thomas Park's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old air conditioning and floor wax, the particular combination that I associated with institutions that had been doing their work quietly for a long time. His secretary was a woman of perhaps 60, who wore her reading glasses pushed up on her head and offered me water before I had fully sat down. I liked her immediately. Thomas came out himself to greet me. He was older than I remembered from our last meeting, or perhaps I was simply better at noticing age now than I had been then. He shook my hand and led me into his office, and closed the door and sat across from me with his hands folded on the desk and said, "Tell me." I told him. All of it, in order, with the notebook open on my knee so that I did not misremember dates or sequences. I told him about Vincent's increasing interest in the house, about Dr. Nguyen's irregular visit, about the paper I had found behind the deed. I told him about Celeste's connection to the clinic through the holding company, about the form I had found online with the filed signature that was not Vincent's. Thomas listened without interrupting. He made notes. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, reading back through what he had written. "The signature on the filed form," he said. "You said it wasn't Vincent's." "No. Whose was it?" "I believe it was the medical director of the clinic." "Which means they did not need Vincent to initiate the legal process. Celeste's network filed it through the clinic itself. As the referring medical authority." I paused. "I need you to confirm this. I need to know the exact legal standing of a petition filed that way, and whether it can proceed without a family member's formal support." Thomas looked at me over his reading glasses. "You understood all of this from reading the provincial procedure form." "I have read a great deal of documentation in my life," I said. He nodded slowly. Then, "Miriam, how long do we have? If the assessment is dated 6 weeks ago, and the filing window is 6 months, we have approximately 18 weeks before the petition becomes actionable. But I would prefer not to wait 18 weeks. Neither would I." He uncapped his pen. "Here is what we need." We spent an hour outlining the strategy. Thomas would file for an independent psychiatric evaluation immediately through Dr. Raymond Cho, who he had worked with on 3 previous elder law cases and trusted completely. The evaluation would follow DSM-5 protocol, precisely every question, every standardized scale, every timing notation, conducted and documented in a way that would hold up against any challenge in court. "They will argue that any evaluation we commission is biased," Thomas said. "Let them. Dr. Cho's methodology will speak for itself." I closed my notebook. I spent 35 years administering these assessments. I know what a clean evaluation looks like, and I know what Dr. Nguyen's looks like by comparison. Thomas almost smiled. "I want your clinical analysis of Nguyen's assessment in writing, your professional opinion on its methodology, its irregularities, and its departure from accepted protocol. I've already begun drafting it." He looked at me for a moment. "Most clients come to me frightened," he said, "overwhelmed. They've been caught off guard." "I was a psychiatric nurse," I said. "I spent my career watching people try to tell other people what their minds were and were not capable of. I always knew I would need to defend myself from that one day. I simply did not expect it to come from this direction. I picked up my bag. What else do you need from me? Financial records. Everything you have. The more complete, the better. I have every bank statement since 1987, I said, organized by year, in labeled folders, in the third drawer of my filing cabinet. This time he did smile. I stopped at the market on the way home. Not because I needed anything urgently, but because I needed to move through ordinary life for an hour and let my mind settle around everything that had been decided. I bought chrysanthemums. I bought the rice I preferred. I stopped at the tea cellar I had used for 15 years and bought 2 packets of the green tea that Fuck had drunk every morning and that I continued to buy out of a habit I saw no reason to break. The tea seller, an elderly woman who had known me since before Lily was born, handed me my packets and looked at me carefully. "You seem well," she said. "I am well," I said. And I meant it. Not in the way of someone performing wellness for an audience, but in the way of a woman who has identified her problem, assembled her tools, and begun the work. There is a particular steadiness that comes from that. From knowing what the shape of the fight is and having the skill to meet it. My grandmother had a name for that steadiness. She said it was the quality of deep water, the water in old wells and in the still parts of rivers where the current runs beneath the surface without announcing itself. She said you could always tell the depth of water by how quiet it was. Still, water runs deepest. I carried my market bag home and changed into my house clothes and lit the incense and sat at my desk. I laid out the financial folders in chronological order. I found the earliest statement, from March 1987, and set it on top, and began to work my way forward through 36 years of my own careful record-keeping. I was 3 years in when my phone showed a message from a number I did not recognize. A single line of text. No greeting, no name, just an address, an office address in the commercial district, and a time. Tomorrow afternoon at 2. I read it twice. Then I searched the address. It belonged to the real estate consultancy registered under Celeste's name. Someone inside that office had just contacted me directly. And from the phrasing of the message, not an invitation, not a threat, but the flat, careful language of someone passing information at personal risk, I did not think it was Celeste who had sent it. The address in the commercial district led me to a narrow office on the second floor of a building that smelled of new paint and photocopier toner. The name on the frosted glass door was the consultancy name I had found in the business registry. Nothing that said Celeste, nothing that said family, nothing that connected it to the house on Tran Hung Dao Street where I had lived for 41 years. I arrived 10 minutes early. I always arrive early. It is not impatience. It is the habit of someone who has spent decades in rooms where being unprepared had consequences that fell on people other than herself. The person who opened the door was a young woman. Mid-20s, perhaps. She had the look of someone who had been awake for a long time and had decided that the discomfort of what she was about to do was less than the discomfort of staying silent. I recognized that calculation. I had seen it on the faces of nurses who came to me with concerns about colleagues, or patients who finally decided to tell the truth about what was happening at home. She told me her name was Phuong. She had worked for the consultancy for 14 months as an administrative assistant. She had been the one who filed the property valuations, typed the correspondence, managed the calendar. She handed me a folder before I had fully sat down. "I'm leaving the position at the end of the week," she said. "I should have done this sooner." Inside the folder were printed copies of email correspondence, Celeste's name in the sender field, the medical director of the clinic in the recipient field. Dates going back 16 months. I read the first 3 emails without speaking. The language was careful, the careful language of people who believe they are being clever. References to the assessment as the evaluation process. References to the petition filing as the next administrative step. References to the property as the asset in question. The 4th email contained a line that I read twice and then set down on my knee. Once the evaluation is on file and the petition proceeds, we move to property management transfer immediately. The subject will not have legal standing to contest. The subject. 16 months of correspondence, and in all of it, I was the subject. I thanked Phuong. I asked if she would be willing to provide a formal statement if needed. She said yes. I wrote Thomas Park's name and number on a page from my notebook and gave it to her. Then I put the folder in my bag, beside my own notebooks, and I went home. The call from Vincent came 4 days later. Not a visit this time. A call, at 8 in the evening, when I was sitting with my tea and my financial records, and the quiet work of a woman building her case from the inside out. His voice had changed. The careful gentleness he had been using for months, the registered concern voice, the son who worries performance was gone. What replaced it was something I had not heard from my son in 40 years. Not since he was 8 years old and wanted something he had decided he was going to have regardless of what anyone said. Mother, I need to talk to you about the house. All right, I said. Celeste and I have been discussing it for some time. Given your situation living alone, your age, the size of the property, we think it would be appropriate for us to take over the management of the asset. The asset, he used the same word the email had used. I manage it perfectly well, I said. The assessment suggests otherwise. A pause. Dr. Nguyen's evaluation indicates early cognitive decline. We have medical documentation now, Mother. We're not trying to be difficult. We're trying to help you. I held the phone and looked at Fuchs' photograph on the altar. The candle, the brass incense burner with the dragon handles. What specifically does the evaluation say? I asked. A short silence. He had not expected the question to be that direct. It says there are concerns about your ability to manage complex financial decisions independently, that you showed signs of disorientation during the assessment and had difficulty with sequential reasoning tasks. Disorientation, difficulty with sequential reasoning. I had asked Dr. Nguyen which standardized assessment instrument he was using. I had identified the irregularities in his questioning protocol within 4 minutes. I had then gone home and written 11 pages of clinical notes from memory. I see, I said. We're not doing this to hurt you, but we have a responsibility, as your family, to make sure you're protected. The documentation is already filed with the court. A hearing will be scheduled within the next 2 months. His voice carried the particular tone of someone delivering news they have decided is final. It would be easier if you didn't contest it. Easier for whom? I asked. He did not answer that. 3 days after Vincent's call, they came to the house together. I had known they would. When people have decided the performance is no longer necessary, they tend to want to see the effect of that decision in person. Vincent and Celeste arrived on a Saturday morning, no call this time, no fruit, no pretense of a social visit. Vincent had a document folder under his arm. Celeste walked slightly behind him, her eyes moving over the rooms, the way they had been moving for months, but no longer bothering to conceal it. I offered them tea. Vincent declined. Celeste accepted and then did not drink it. We've spoken with the lawyer handling the petition, Vincent said, standing in the center of my main room, in front of the altar, in front of Fuchs' photograph, in front of 41 years of a life he was proposing to administer on my behalf. The hearing date has been set. 6 weeks from Thursday. That's quite soon, I said. Given the medical documentation, the court agreed to expedite. He opened the folder and placed 2 pages on the coffee table in front of me. This is a power of attorney document. If you sign this voluntarily, the court process becomes unnecessary. We take over management of the property and your financial accounts. You continue to live here, and everything proceeds without a public hearing. I looked at the document. I did not touch it. Celeste leaned forward slightly. It's the simplest solution, Mother. For everyone. I looked at her, then at Vincent, then at the document on my coffee table with the signature line at the bottom, blank and waiting. I'd like to have my lawyer review it, I said. Of course. Vincent's voice had the smoothness of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. Take whatever time you need. But the petition proceeds regardless. The evaluation is on file. The court has the documentation. He closed the folder. With or without your signature, this process is moving forward. He said it the way he might say that rain was coming. A fact. An inevitability. Something a reasonable person accepts and prepares for, rather than argues against. Celeste picked up her untouched tea, finally, and set it back down without drinking it. We're not your enemies, she said. I did not answer. They left 10 minutes later. I stood at the window and watched the car pull away from the gate that Fook had built post by post in the summer of 1983. Then I turned back to the room. The document was still on my coffee table. 2 pages, a signature line, a version of the future they had decided was already written. I picked up the document and put it in my bag, next to the folder Phuong had given me. Then I sat at my desk and called Thomas. "They've set the hearing date," I said. 6 weeks. "We'll be ready," he said. I looked at the altar, at Phuc's photograph, at the teacup I washed and replaced every morning without fail. But what Thomas did not know, what no one knew yet, because I had not yet decided whether it changed anything or simply added to what I already had, was that when Vincent placed those documents on my coffee table and leaned forward with his folder and his decided voice, something had slipped from the breast pocket of his jacket and fallen into the gap between the cushion and the arm of the sofa. A folded receipt. I had not drawn attention to it. I had said nothing, but the moment they walked out my gate, I retrieved it. And what was printed on that receipt made the power of attorney document on my coffee table look like the smallest part of what they had been planning. The receipt was from a notary office in the 3rd District. I sat with it at my desk for a long time before I unfolded it completely. Not because I was afraid of what it said. I have never been the kind of woman who delays difficult information, but because I understood, in the way you understand certain things before your mind has fully formed the words for them, that what I was holding was not simply another piece of evidence. It was the last piece. The one that showed me the full shape of what had been built around me while I changed the altar flowers and lit the incense and believed, in whatever small remaining part of me still believed such things, that my son's cruelty had a limit. I unfolded it. It was a notarized transfer document. A pre-signed property conveyance form, prepared and witnessed, for the house on Tran Hung Dao Street. The transfer was dated 3 months from now. The recipient was not Vincent. It was not a holding company, not a consultancy, not any name connected to Celeste's network of registered businesses that I had spent weeks carefully mapping. The recipient was a property developer, a company name I did not recognize. I wrote it in my notebook and searched it on my laptop with hands that were, for the first time since this began, not entirely steady. The company had purchased 11 properties in the past 4 years. All of them in older residential districts. All of them, according to the business press coverage I found after 20 minutes of searching, demolished within 18 months of purchase to make way for commercial construction. 11 properties. 11 families worth of history, reduced to a transaction in a developer's portfolio. And my house, Phuc's house, the house with the gate he built post by post, the frangipani tree he planted, the altar where his photograph still sat in the same place, I had said it 11 years ago, had already been sold to them, not listed, not considered. Sold. 3 months before I would have any legal standing left to object. The power of attorney had never been about managing my affairs. It was about clearing the legal path for a transfer that was already signed, already notarized, already dated. They had not been planning to take care of me. They had been planning to erase the place where I had lived my entire adult life, and they had needed my incapacity declaration to make it uncontestable. I do not know how long I sat there. The candle on the altar burned down. The room went dark around me without my noticing. At some point, the street outside grew quiet the way it does after 10 o'clock, when the motorbikes thin out, and only the occasional car passes, and the neighborhood settles into itself. The frangipani was invisible in the dark, but I could smell it. That particular sweetness that had no opinion about what was happening inside the house, it grew beside. I thought about the morning Phuc and I moved in. The red clay lot, the lean of the mango tree. Phuc standing in the empty space that would become our main room, turning slowly, reading the light, deciding where the altar would go. "You start with what you want to protect," he had said. "Then you build around it." I thought about what he had been protecting, not the structure, not the walls or the roof or the floor. Those were materials. What he had been protecting was the accumulation of days, ordinary days, difficult days, days so full of children and work and the small negotiations of a shared life that you did not notice them becoming the architecture of who you were until you stood inside them and felt their weight. Vincent had grown up inside that weight. He had eaten at the table where I now kept my notebooks. He had stood at the kitchen doorframe each year while his father marked his height in pencil. He had sat at the altar, and bowed his head at Fuchs' funeral with what I had taken for grief and was now uncertain how to name. I let myself feel it, all of it. I did not push it down or redirect it into the clean language of documentation. I sat in the dark in my husband's house and felt what it was to be a mother who had raised a son for 40 years and discovered that the capacity for that kind of betrayal had been inside him all along, growing quietly, the way damage grows in old wood invisible, until the moment it gives way. I allowed myself 1 hour for this. 1 hour, in the dark, with the smell of frangipani and the cold tea and Fuchs' photograph watching from the altar. Then I turned on the lamp. I called Lily at 11 o'clock. I did not apologize for the hour. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had not been sleeping either, which told me she had known, or suspected, more than she had said. "Mom." Her voice was careful, awake. "I need you to come tomorrow morning," I said. "Early. Bring nothing. Tell no one." A pause. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I want you to hear it from me directly, with the documents in front of you, before you have to decide what to do with the information." Another pause, longer. "I'll be there at 7, she said. I thanked her, and ended the call and sat for another moment at my desk. Then I took out a fresh envelope and wrote the date on the outside and placed inside it the receipt, a copy of the developer's property record that I had printed from my laptop, and 3 pages of my own notes connecting the clinic, the holding company, the petition filing, and the notarized transfer. I sealed the envelope and placed it behind the altar, with the others. Then I took out one more sheet of paper. I had been keeping my clinical notes and my financial records and my timeline in separate notebooks. But there was one piece of documentation I had not yet formalized: the written professional analysis that Thomas had requested of Dr. Nguyen's assessment methodology. My expert opinion, in clinical language, on why the evaluation that had been used to initiate the court petition was procedurally invalid. I began to write it at 11:30 at night. I wrote for 2.5 hours. Every irregularity, every interrupted response, every question delivered out of sequence, every departure from accepted protocol, cited against the specific standardized tools the questions had been drawn from. The assessment of a 35-year psychiatric nursing professional on the quality of work performed by a man whose license was 18 months old. I wrote it in the same small, precise hand I had used for clinical documentation since 1979. When I finished, I read it back once. Then I signed it with my full name and my professional registration number, which remained valid under the lifetime licensure provision for retired practitioners and had never, in 35 years, been associated with a single complaint. I folded the document and placed it on top of everything else. The altar candle had gone out. The room smelled of sandalwood and old wood and something else, not grief exactly, but the residue of it. The particular atmosphere of a room where something has been fully understood and set aside so that the hands can get back to work. I thought of the first time I had understood, as a young nurse, that the most important thing you could do for a patient was to document everything before anyone could tell you what you had or had not seen. I thought of the 41 years of this house, the frangipani, the gate, the altar. I thought of a developer's company name on a notarized transfer document dated 3 months from now, and I thought, they have already made their worst move. They have shown me the full depth of what they planned. Now it was simply a matter of making sure that everyone who needed to see it, the court, the bar association, the psychiatric review board, and the room full of people who would one day understand what I had been sitting quietly in that chair preparing, would see it too. All of it. Every single page. Lily arrived at 6:53. I heard the gate before I heard her knock. The particular sound of it, the slight resistance on the left side from the frangipani roots, that I had never had corrected because Fuchs had built it and I saw no reason to change what he had made. She came through the garden and I opened the door before she reached it, and we stood for a moment looking at each other in the early light. She had her father's eyes, not the color those she had from me, but the quality of them, the way they took in a room without rushing, the way they settled on what mattered without needing to be directed. I put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table and did not speak while I made the tea, which told me she understood that what I was about to tell her required the ordinary ritual of a cup and a chair and a moment of preparation before the words. I laid out the documents in order. The timeline, the printed emails from Fuang's folder, the notarized transfer receipt, the the developer's property records, my clinical analysis of Dr. Nguyen's assessment, the financial records Thomas had requested, now fully organized and cross-referenced by year. Lily read everything without speaking. She was a social worker. She had spent 12 years sitting across tables from people whose families had betrayed them in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. She knew how to hold difficult information without letting the weight of it show on her face until she had finished absorbing it completely. When she reached the transfer receipt, she stopped. She read it twice. Then she set it down precisely. The way you set down something you do not want to handle carelessly. 3 months, she said. Yes. She looked at the developer's records, the 11 properties, the demolition timeline. Then she looked at me, and for just a moment, one moment, before she gathered herself, I saw in her face what I had allowed myself to feel the night before, alone in the dark. The grief of it. The specific grief of understanding that someone you loved had been capable of this. Mom, she said, what do you need from me? I had prepared a list. Thomas Park's office became a second home in the weeks that followed. I went every Tuesday and Thursday, always arriving 10 minutes early, always bringing my notebooks in the canvas bag I had used for hospital rounds, and saw no reason to retire simply because I had. His secretary learned how I took my tea. The work divided itself into clear channels, the way serious work always does when you have planned it properly. The first channel was Dr. Raymond Cho's evaluation. He came to the house on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Thomas had engaged him. He was a compact man of perhaps 55, precise in his movements, with the particular economy of someone who has spent decades measuring the distance between what people say and what they mean. He brought his own forms. He explained each section before he began it. He administered the evaluation in its complete standardized form, without interruption, without leading questions, without the particular practiced casualness that Dr. Nguyen had used to mask the absence of proper protocol. It took 3 hours and 40 minutes. At the end, he sat back and looked at his notes and said, Mrs. Tran, I will have my written report to your attorney within the week, but I can tell you now that my findings will not support the petition currently before the court. I didn't expect they would, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Your clinical analysis of the previous assessment was included in the materials your attorney sent me. It was accurate. The departures from standardized protocol that you identified were significant. He paused. In 30 years of practice, I have rarely seen an evaluation as poorly constructed as the one filed with this petition. I administered that type of assessment for 35 years, I said. I know, he said. It shows. The second channel was Phuong. Thomas met with her formally on a Thursday afternoon, with a court reporter present, and took her full statement. She had brought her own documentation, printed records of correspondence she had saved to a personal drive before giving notice, records of calendar appointments between Celeste and the clinic's medical director, records of the property transfer discussions that had been conducted, in writing, through the consultancy's official email system. Celeste had been thorough in her planning. She had not been thorough about where she conducted it. Thomas called me after the meeting. The statement is strong, he said, and the documentary evidence she's provided establishes a direct connection between the clinic, the consultancy, and the transfer arrangement that the petition was designed to facilitate. Does it establish that the petition was filed in bad faith? It establishes, Thomas said carefully, that the evaluation was commissioned for a purpose other than medical assessment, and that the legal process was initiated as a mechanism for property acquisition rather than family welfare. A pause, which is what the court will need to see. I wrote this down in my notebook, in the column labeled What I Can Prove. It was the longest column now. The third channel was the financial records. I spent 4 evenings at my desk, organizing 36 years of documentation into the clear, cross-referenced package that Thomas had requested. Every bank statement, every property tax receipt, every utility payment, insurance renewal, household expense record, all of it demonstrating, in the cumulative weight of decades, that the woman described in Dr. Nguyen's assessment as showing signs of difficulty with complex financial management independently had been managing those finances with consistent precision since the year her eldest son was learning to ride a bicycle. I labeled each folder in my small, precise hand. I made 2 copies of everything. One set went to Thomas. The second set I sealed in a new envelope and placed behind the altar, with the notebooks, in the space between the table and the wall where I kept what mattered most. Fook would have found this methodical. He was a methodical man. He would have understood the work of it, not the drama, not the injury, but the patient, unrushed accumulation of what was true, set down in order, ready to be presented to whoever needed to see it. Lily came every Sunday. She did not always stay long. Sometimes we simply sat in the kitchen with our tea and talked about her week. About the frangipani that was coming into fuller bloom now. About the neighbor's tomatoes that Mrs. Hoa remained dissatisfied with. We did not always talk about the hearing. The hearing was present in the room, the way important things are present, not requiring discussion, simply there, the way the altar was there, the way the gate was there, the way the weight of 41 years was there in every board and wall and window of this house. Once, on a Sunday in the third week, Lily sat across from me and said, "Are you afraid?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "not anymore." When did it stop? The night I found the receipt. When I understood the full shape of it, I looked at the garden through the window. Fear is for when you don't know what you're dealing with. Once you know, it becomes something else. What does it become? Work, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Vincent called me. I set down my cup. What did he say? That he was worried about you. That the assessment showed real concerns. And he hoped I would encourage you not to make things difficult. She looked at her hands on the table. He sounded very certain that it was already decided. He is very certain, I said. Is he wrong? I looked at the altar. At Fook's photograph. At the brass incense burner with the dragon handles worn smooth by the hands of generations of women who had kept their homes and their histories against whatever came for them. Yes, I said simply. The hearing was in 4 days. Thomas had prepared everything. Dr. Cho's evaluation was filed with the court. Phuong's statement was in evidence. The financial records were organized and cross-referenced and ready. My clinical analysis of Dr. Hien's assessment was signed with my full name and my professional registration number and placed on top of everything else. I had not told Vincent or Celeste any of this. I had continued to answer Vincent's calls with the same measured calm I had maintained since the first day I understood what was happening. I had not mentioned Thomas's name, or Dr. Cho's name, or Phuong's name. I had not indicated, in any conversation or message or interaction, that I had spent 6 weeks building a case that would dismantle everything they believed they had already won. They had come into my house with their clipboard and their document folder and their certainty. They had looked at a 68-year-old woman sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap and seen someone who did not understand what was being prepared around her. In 4 days, they would walk into a courtroom believing that the outcome had already been decided. And they would be right that the outcome had already been decided. They were simply wrong about which direction it would fall. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the particular coolness of a room that has held a great many difficult conversations and absorbed all of them without comment. I arrived 20 minutes early. Thomas was already there, at the respondent's table, arranging documents in the order we had agreed upon. He looked up when I came in and gave a single nod. That was enough. Thomas was not a man who wasted words on reassurance when the preparation had been thorough. The preparation had been thorough. I sat and folded my hands in my lap and looked at the room. It was a mid-sized civil court chamber. Fluorescent lighting, softened slightly by the morning sun coming through the high windows on the east wall. A raised bench where the judge would sit. The petitioner's table across the aisle, still empty. 3 rows of seats behind the bar, already partially filled. Mrs. Hoa in the second row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her good jacket on. Phuong near the end of the row, not looking at anyone. Lily in the front row, directly behind me, close enough that I could have reached back and touched her hand if I had wanted to. I did not turn around. But I knew she was there. Vincent and Celeste arrived 12 minutes before the scheduled time. Vincent was wearing the gray shirt again, the client meeting shirt, the one he had worn the day he arrived with Dr. Hien and his clipboard. Celeste was in a dark blazer, her bag over her shoulder, her nails still that color I had decided months ago I did not like. Their lawyer, a man I did not recognize, walked between them and spoke in a low voice and carried a document folder that was considerably thinner than Thomas's. Vincent looked at me once when he sat down. He looked the way he had looked in my main room when he placed the power of attorney document on my coffee table, certain, settled. The look of a man who has already made the calculation and confirmed the answer and is now simply waiting for the formality to conclude. I looked back at him without expression. Then I turned to face the bench and waited for the judge. Judge Lan Phuong Vo was a woman of perhaps 60, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the bearing of someone who had been deciding difficult things for a long time and had made her peace with the weight of it. She reviewed the petition summary without speaking for several minutes after taking the bench. Then she looked up. This is a petition to declare Mrs. Miriam Tran legally incompetent and transfer management of her affairs to the petitioner, her son Vincent Tran, citing medical evaluation indicating cognitive decline. She looked at Vincent's table. Counsel, you may present the basis for the petition. Vincent's lawyer stood. He was competent and organized. He presented Dr. Hien's evaluation with professional confidence, citing the findings, the alleged disorientation, the difficulty with sequential reasoning, the recommendation for supervised financial management. He submitted the evaluation as Exhibit A. He spoke about Vincent's concern for his mother's welfare and the family's desire to ensure her care and security. He spoke for 11 minutes. When he finished, Judge Vo looked at Thomas. Respondent. Thomas stood. He did not hurry. Your Honor, the respondent, Mrs. Miriam Tran, contests this petition on 3 grounds. First, the medical evaluation submitted as the basis for the petition is procedurally invalid. Second, an independent evaluation, conducted according to full standardized protocol, directly contradicts its findings. Third, evidence before the court establishes that the petition was not filed to protect Mrs. Tran's welfare, but to facilitate an unauthorized property transfer arranged without her knowledge or consent. Vincent's lawyer was on his feet immediately. Objection. Your Honor, that characterization is... Sit down, counsel. Judge Vo's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. You'll have opportunity to respond. Continue, Mr. Park. Thomas opened his first folder. Respondent submits Exhibit 1, a professional clinical analysis of the evaluation filed as Exhibit A, authored by Mrs. Tran herself, who holds a lifetime professional registration in psychiatric nursing with 35 years of specialization in cognitive assessment. He handed the document to the clerk. I watched it travel across the room, my handwriting. My registration number at the bottom, 35 years of professional authority, signed and dated and placed in front of a judge who put on her reading glasses and began to read it with the focused attention of someone who was going to read every line before she turned the page. She read for 4 minutes without speaking. Then, counsel, this analysis identifies 17 specific departures from standardized assessment protocol in the evaluation your client submitted. Vincent's lawyer said something about professional bias and the subjectivity of clinical interpretation. Judge Vo removed her glasses and looked at him. Are you suggesting that a 35-year specialist in psychiatric assessment is unqualified to identify procedural irregularities in a psychiatric assessment conducted by a practitioner with an 18-month license? A pause. No, Your Honor. Then let's continue. Thomas submitted Dr. Cho's evaluation as Exhibit 2. He submitted the financial records as Exhibit 3. 36 years of documentation, organized by year, cross-referenced by category, establishing in the cumulative weight of decades exactly what kind of mind had been managing, exactly what kind of affairs for exactly how long. Then he submitted Exhibit 4. Phuong's statement. The printed email correspondence. The business registry connection between the clinic and the consultancy registered under Celeste's name. The record of the pre-signed property transfer to the developer. The notarized receipt that had fallen from Vincent's jacket pocket onto my sofa cushion on a Saturday morning when he had come to my house to tell me the outcome was already decided. The room was very quiet while the clerk distributed copies. I watched Vincent receive his copy. I watched him open it. I watched him reach the page with the developer's transfer receipt, the one he had not known I had found, had not known I had copied, had not known I had held in the second drawer of my desk, alongside the green folder and the rubber-banded tax receipts and the land certificate in its plastic sleeve. I watched his face. He did not look at me. He looked at the page, and then he looked at his lawyer, and his lawyer looked at the page, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Thomas spoke into the silence. Your Honor, the petition before this court was not a son's concern for his mother's welfare. It was the legal mechanism for a property transfer that had already been arranged, already notarized, and already dated 3 months from today, to a commercial developer who has demolished 11 residential properties in 4 years. He paused. Mrs. Tran was not to be protected by this process. She was to be legally silenced by it. Judge Vo was looking at the transfer receipt. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. Not at Thomas, not at the documents, not at the petitioner's table. At me. A 68-year-old woman sitting with her hands folded in her lap at the respondent's table, wearing the pale blue adai she saved for important occasions, with a canvas bag on the floor beside her chair that contained 3 decades of her own careful record-keeping. I met her eyes, and in that moment I thought of what my son had said about me, months ago, in the room that smelled of furniture polish, to a lawyer with clean fingernails who was writing on a yellow notepad. She's not competent enough to know what she wants anymore. I thought of how certain he had been, how settled, how thoroughly he had believed that the woman who raised him, who had spent 35 years inside the most demanding discipline of human assessment, who had documented her own life with the same precision she had brought to 35 years of clinical practice, how thoroughly he had believed that woman could be rendered invisible with a clipboard and a signature. I thought of this without anger. I had moved past anger weeks ago. What I felt, sitting in that courtroom with the evidence laid out in front of a judge who was still looking at the transfer receipt, was something quieter and more complete. It was the feeling of a case properly documented, evidence properly presented. A professional lifetime of careful work finally turned toward the most personal task it had ever been asked to perform. Judge Vo set down the document. Petition denied, she said. With prejudice. She removed her glasses. I am also referring the matter of the fraudulently commissioned evaluation to the Provincial Medical Board and the property transfer arrangement to the prosecutor's office for review of potential fraud charges. She looked at Vincent's table. Counsel, I suggest you advise your clients to retain separate representation. The gavel came down. In the front row behind me, I heard Lily release a breath she had been holding, it seemed, for a very long time. I sat for a moment in the quiet after the gavel. Then I reached down and picked up my canvas bag and set it on my lap and held it with both hands. The bag that had carried my notebooks to Thomas's office, that had carried the financial records, the clinical analysis, the receipt that had fallen from my son's pocket onto my sofa, that had carried for 35 years before any of this, the documentation of other people's lives kept safe by a woman who understood that the written record was the only thing that stood between a person and whatever someone else decided about them. I had known that for a long time. I had simply needed, in the end, to apply it to myself. The collapse did not happen all at once. That is the thing about structures built on dishonesty. They do not fall the way honest things fall, cleanly, with a clear moment of before and after. They come apart in pieces, each piece revealing the next weakness, until what remains is not a ruin but a dismantling, methodical and unstoppable, following the logic of its own internal failures. I watched it happen from the quiet of my kitchen, over tea, over 3 weeks, through Thomas's calls and Lily's updates, and the occasional note from Mrs. Hoa, who had lived next door for 22 years and had always paid close attention to what moved on our street. It began with the lawyers. Vincent and Celeste had retained a single attorney for the petition. When Judge Vo suggested they seek separate representation, that single attorney had driven away from the courthouse in a car with both of them in it, and by the following morning, he had filed motions to withdraw from both cases simultaneously. 30 years of legal practice had given him, apparently, a reliable sense of when a situation was about to become significantly worse, and he preferred not to be present for it. Vincent retained a new attorney by the end of that week. Celeste retained a different one. This, Thomas told me, was the first significant fracture. When co-conspirators lawyer up separately, he said, they are no longer co-conspirators. They are 2 people in adjacent rooms, each calculating how much the other one is worth sacrificing. I wrote this in my notebook. I found it accurate. The medical board moved faster than I had expected. Dr. Nguyen, whose name on the medical registry differed, as I had noted, from the name he had given when he arrived at my gate, was summoned for a formal review within 10 days of Judge Vo's referral. Thomas received a courtesy copy of the notice, which he forwarded to me with a single line of his own. Your clinical analysis was cited in the referral language. I read the notice carefully. The board's preliminary findings, which became available through the public record 3 weeks later, established that the practitioner had administered a non-standardized assessment instrument, documented conclusions inconsistent with the questions actually asked, and submitted a formal psychiatric evaluation to a court without conducting the minimum examination hours required by provincial medical standards. His license was suspended pending full investigation. The clinic, Celeste's clinic, the one registered through the holding company with the name that was not her own, ceased operations the following week. The building went quiet. The website disappeared. I did not feel satisfaction about this in the way I might have expected. What I felt was closer to the feeling I had known in my working years when a misdiagnosis was caught in time and the correct record was restored, not triumph. Correction. The property transfer unraveled more slowly, but more completely. The developer's agreement, as Thomas explained it to me over 2 hours at his conference table, had been contingent on the successful completion of the incompetency petition. The petition had not only failed, it had been denied with prejudice and referred to the prosecutor's office. The developer, whose 11 previous acquisitions had all been conducted with considerably less legal visibility than this one, quietly withdrew from the arrangement within 2 weeks of the hearing. The notarized transfer document became, in Thomas's precise language, a nullity. The house on Tran Hung Dao Street remained mine. I did not return to it differently after the hearing. I came home the same way I had come home for 41 years, through Fuchs Gate, past the Frangipani, through the front door, to the main room where the altar sat against the east wall in the morning light. I changed my shoes. I made tea. I lit 2 sticks of incense and stood for a moment in the smell of sandalwood and old wood. The house felt the same. I was glad of that. I had not wanted it to feel like a victory. I had wanted it to feel like home. Vincent called me 3 weeks after the hearing. I almost did not answer. Then I thought of the 35 years I had sat with people in their most difficult moments, and chosen, consistently, to remain present rather than withdraw, and I picked up the phone. He did not apologize. I had not expected him to. He was not, at his core, a man who had learned to do that easily, and an apology offered under legal pressure is not an apology in any meaningful sense. What he said, after a long pause, was, "Celeste is saying I was the one who initiated the clinic arrangement. Were you?" I asked. Another pause. It was her connection. Her idea. I thought he stopped. I thought it was the right thing. I considered this for a moment. The voice of my eldest son, 40 years old, telling me he had thought stripping his mother of her legal standing and selling her house to a developer was the right thing. "Vincent," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. All right. When you sat in your father's chair, in our main room, while Dr. Nguyen asked me questions designed to make me fail, what did you think about?" A very long silence. "I thought about the money," he said finally. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in 2 years, perhaps longer. "I know," I said. "I could see that. I could see it clearly." I paused. "That is the difference between us, Vincent. I have always been able to see clearly. I simply choose, most of the time, not to say everything I see." He had no response to this. We ended the call shortly after. I did not know what would come next between us, whether there was a road back from what he had done, or whether some distances, once made, simply remain. I did not try to decide that afternoon. It was not a decision that required rushing. It was Lily who told me about Celeste. She came on a Sunday, 3 weeks after the hearing, with the particular expression she wore when she had news she was still processing herself. We sat at the kitchen table. The frangipani was visible through the window, fully in bloom now, white flowers open against the green. "Celeste filed for divorce," Lily said. I set down my cup. She submitted a statement to her attorney claiming that Vincent pressured her into the arrangement, that the clinic connection and the property plan were his idea and she had expressed reservations. Lily looked at me steadily. "Her lawyer has requested the court correspondence," as supporting documentation for her divorce filing. I thought about this for a moment. Celeste, who had arranged the clinic's business registration through her own holding company. Celeste, who had discussed property values at my open refrigerator with her back turned. Celeste, whose printed emails to the medical director were currently in the possession of Thomas Park and the provincial prosecutor's office. Celeste, who was now attempting to use the evidence of her own conspiracy as proof that the conspiracy had been someone else's. Does her attorney know about Phuong's statement? I asked. Thomas has already notified the court, Lily said. The emails are in evidence. Her name is on the business registry. The timeline is documented. I nodded. Will she face charges? Thomas says likely yes. Both of them. Lily wrapped her hands around her cup. The prosecutor is looking at fraud, elder financial abuse, and the clinic arrangement separately. I looked at the frangipani through the window. Two people who had built something together, pulling in opposite directions now, each trying to make the other one the weight that sinks first. Each calculating, with the same cold precision they had applied to my house and my legal standing and my capacity to know my own mind, how much the other one was worth sacrificing. I had not done this to them. They had done it to each other, with the same tools they had used to come for me: calculation without conscience, certainty without substance, a complete failure to account for the possibility that the person across the table was paying closer attention than they appeared. That failure had always been the weakest point in their structure. It had simply taken time for the weight of what they had built to find it. I poured fresh tea into Lily's cup. She thanked me. Outside, the frangipani moved in a small wind, the white flowers turning slightly. The way things turn when they have been standing in one place comes, long enough to know which direction the light comes from. Mom, Lily said, are you all right? I thought about it honestly, the way I had thought about her question in the kitchen weeks ago when she had asked if I was afraid. Yes, I said. And this time, it was not the answer of a woman who had made peace with difficulty. It was simpler than that. It was just true. The frangipani bloomed fully in the week after the hearing. I noticed it the way I notice most things without announcement, without marking the moment as significant until later, when significance has had time to settle into its proper shape. One morning I came through the front door and the smell of it was everywhere. White flowers open on every branch, and I stood in the garden for a moment before going inside and simply breathed it. Phuc had planted that tree 30 years ago. He had not lived to see this particular bloom, but the tree had no opinion about that. It bloomed in its own time, the way he had always said things worth keeping did. I went inside and made tea and lit the incense, and stood at the altar for a long time. The legal proceedings wound through the following months, in the methodical way of institutions that have no particular urgency about anything. The prosecutor's office filed charges against Vincent and Celeste, separately fraud, elder financial abuse, abuse of legal process. The clinic's medical director faced the provincial medical board and lost his license permanently. Not suspended pending review but revoked, which Thomas said was unusual and indicated the board had found the evidence unambiguous. I was not required to attend most of these proceedings. Thomas attended on my behalf and called me afterward with clean summaries. I wrote the summaries in my notebook and filed them in the appropriate folder and did not dwell on them beyond what was necessary to understand. What I dwelt on, in those months, was simpler. The gate that needed a small repair on the hinge, not the lean from the frangipani roots. I had decided to leave that as it was, but a separate looseness in the upper bracket that Phuc would have noticed years ago, and I had been putting off. I hired a man from the end of the lane who did this kind of work honestly, and for a fair price, and who did not make me feel that accepting his help was a concession of any kind. The notebooks behind the altar, which I reorganized into proper archival sleeves and labeled by year and placed on the shelf in the storage room where they belonged, alongside the green folder and the rubber-banded tax receipts and the land certificate in its plastic sleeve. The second drawer of my desk, which I cleaned out entirely and refilled with only what I intended to keep there, and which I thereafter kept locked with a key that lived on the ring with the small brass fish. These were not dramatic things. But they were mine, and I did them with the particular attention of a woman who has been reminded of the value of what she tends. Lily came every Sunday. This did not change. What changed was that she began bringing her colleague, sometimes a young woman named Thon, who worked in the same social services office and was, Lily said, trying to understand the elder protection system and its failures. Thon was 26 years old and asked careful questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who intended to do something with what she heard. One Sunday, Thon asked me how I had known what to document. I thought about the question honestly. I did not always know, I said. In the beginning, I kept records because I was a nurse and that was what nurses did. I kept records of my patients' conditions so that no one could later claim those conditions had been different from what I had observed. I kept records to protect people who could not protect themselves. I poured more tea into her cup. I kept the same records at home because the habit did not know how to stop at the end of a shift. And when it became about protecting yourself, then I simply turned the same habit toward the same purpose. I looked at the garden through the window. The tools do not change, only the direction. Thon was quiet for a moment. Then, did you ever think you might lose? I considered this. I thought I might run out of time, I said. The form had a 6-month window, and I did not have 6 months of leisure to work in. That concerned me. I set down my cup. But losing? No. I knew what I had. I had kept it carefully for 36 years. No one can take from you what is documented in your own hand, witnessed by your own consistent life. She wrote something in the small notebook she carried. I recognized the habit immediately. I did not say so, but I was glad to see it. In the spring, 6 months after the hearing, I had Thomas prepare updated estate documentation. Not because I had learned to distrust everyone I had not, and I did not intend to, but because I had learned, with the particular clarity that comes from having nearly lost something irreplaceable, that love is not a substitute for proper paperwork. That the people we trust deserve the clarity of clear arrangements, not the burden of ambiguity left behind by someone who assumed goodwill would be enough. The house would go to Lily, not because she had supported me, though she had, steadily, without drama, in the way of someone who had decided where she stood and saw no reason to revisit it, but because she was the one who had come every Sunday for years before any of this began, who had sat at this kitchen table and drunk this tea, and paid attention to what this house held and treated it accordingly. She cried when I told her, not loudly, just the small, private kind of tears that come when something you did not know you were hoping for is confirmed. I don't need it, Mom, she said. I know, I said. That's partly why. I also established a separate fund, documented and legally protected, for the continued maintenance of the house during my lifetime and its preservation for 20 years after, so that whoever lived within its walls would do so with the understanding that this was a place with a history, and histories deserve to be kept. Thomas called it an unusual arrangement. I told him unusual was not the same as incorrect. He agreed. On the evening that the legal proceedings formally concluded, not with drama, not with a single decisive moment, but with a letter from the court office that Thomas forwarded with the note Times. It's done, Times. I sat at my desk as the light went gold through the garden window, and I let the day settle around me. The frangipani was still blooming. It had been blooming for months now, longer than usual, as if it had decided this particular season warranted extra attention. I thought about the room that smelled of furniture polish and the lawyer with clean fingernails and the yellow notepad. I thought about my son's voice saying she's not competent enough to know what she wants anymore, and the particular certainty in it, the absolute confidence of someone who had looked at a 68-year-old woman sitting quietly in a chair and seen only what he had needed her to be. I thought about the 35 years I had spent in rooms with people whose minds others had decided to define for them, the care I had taken to document, precisely and without assumption, what I actually observed, the discipline of separating what was true from what was convenient. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen, and her hands moving without hurry or waste, and the phrase she used when she spoke about the kind of strength that does not announce itself. Some things cannot be taken from you because they are not stored anywhere that can be reached. They are in the hands that have held 36 years of receipts, and the eyes that read an irregular assessment protocol in 4 minutes, and the mind that turns, without panic, toward whatever the problem actually is. They are in the water that runs beneath the surface, that does not make itself known until it is needed, and then is found to have been there all along. I closed my notebook. I capped my pen. I set both beside the green folder in the second drawer, and locked it with the key on the ring with the small brass fish. Then I went to the altar and lit the evening incense, and stood in the smell of sandalwood while the smoke rose in its thin, unhurried line. Outside, the frangipani moved in the last of the light. The house was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet, when they know who they belong to. Still water runs deepest, and the deepest water never announces itself until the moment it is needed. And then it is found to have been there, patient and clear, all along. If anyone has ever looked at you and assumed that age had made you smaller, less sharp, less aware, less capable of knowing exactly what is happening around you, then you already understand something Miriam understood too. Getting older does not diminish what you have built inside yourself. It deepens it. The ones who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. You are. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about people who stayed quiet, stayed patient, and let the truth do what it does. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe that keeping your own records, your own quiet documentation of your life, is one of the most powerful things a person can do to protect themselves,